Please join me in welcoming Bill Lind.
Where does all this stuff we've heard about this morning, the victim feminism, the gay rights movement, the invented statistics, the rewritten history, the lies, the demands, all of the rest of it, where does it come from? I would hope that that would be a question that would be at the forefront of the mind of anyone who is caught up in this. When I was listening to our first panelist talk about the discovery that men and women's brains differ as regard to their ability with spatial relationships, I immediately thought of the fact that anyone who's ever gone grocery shopping knows that, because 9 out of 10 shopping carts left in the middle of the aisle are left there by women. If I said that today on many American campuses, I would be hauled up on trial, literally on trial, in a kangaroo court and face some kind of punishment. For the first time in our history, Americans have to be fearful of what they say, of what they write, and of what they think. They have to be afraid of using the wrong word, a word that is denounced as offensive or insensitive, as racist, sexist, or homophobic. We have seen other countries, particularly in this century, where this has been the case, and we have always regarded them with a mixture of pity and, to be truthful, some amusement, because it has struck us as so strange that people would allow a situation to develop where they had to be afraid of what words they used. But we now have that situation in this country. We have it primarily on college campuses, but we have it spreading throughout the whole society. Where does it come from? What is it? We call it political correctness. The name originated as something of a joke, literally in a comic strip, and we tend to still think of it somehow as only half serious. In fact, it's deadly serious. It is the great disease of our century, the disease that has left tens of millions of people dead in Europe, in Russia, in China, indeed around the world. It is the disease of ideology. PC is not funny. PC is deadly serious. And if we look at it analytically, and if we look at it historically, we quickly find out exactly what it is. Political correctness is cultural Marxism. It is Marxism translated from economic into cultural terms in an effort that goes back not to the 1960s and the hippies and the peace movement, but back to World War I. If we compare the basic tenets of political correctness with classical Marxism, the parallels are very obvious. First of all, both are totalitarian ideologies. The totalitarian nature of political correctness is revealed nowhere more clearly than on college campuses, many of which have at this point become small, ivy-covered North Koreas, where the student or faculty member who dares to cross any of the lines set up by the gender feminists and the homosexual rights activists or the local black group or Hispanic group or any of the other sainted victims groups that PC revolves around quickly finds themselves in judicial trouble. They face, within the small legal system of the college, they face formal charges, they face some kind of star chamber proceeding, and they face punishment. That is a predecessor, that is a little look into the future that political correctness intends for the nation as a whole. Indeed, all ideologies are totalitarian because the essence of an ideology, and I would note that conservatism correctly understood is not an ideology, but the essence of an ideology is it takes some philosophy And it says, on the basis of this philosophy, certain things must be true, such as women are oppressed, and that the whole of the history of our culture is the history of the oppression of women. Since reality contradicts that, reality must be forbidden. It must become forbidden to acknowledge the reality of either our history or our current circumstances. People must be forced to live a lie. And since people are naturally reluctant to live a lie, they naturally use their eyes and ears to look out there and say, well, wait a minute, this just isn't true. I can see it isn't true. The power of the state must be put behind the demand to live a lie. And that is why an ideology invariably creates a totalitarian state. Second, the cultural Marxism of political correctness, like economic Marxism, has a single-factor explanation of history. Economic Marxism says that all of history is determined by ownership of the means of production. Cultural Marxism of political correctness says that all history is determined by power. Which groups, defined in terms of race, sex, etc., have power over which other groups. Nothing else matters. And all literature, indeed, is about that. Everything in the past is about that one thing. Third, just as in classical economic Marxism, certain groups, workers and peasants, are a priori good, and certain groups, the bourgeoisie, capital owners, are evil. So in the cultural Marxism of political correctness, certain groups are good. Feminist women, only feminist women. Non-feminist women are deemed, by the way, not to exist. Blacks, Hispanics, homosexuals, various other groups are determined to be victims and therefore automatically good, regardless of what any of them do. And similarly, white males are determined automatically to be evil. They are the equivalent of the bourgeoisie in economic Marxism. Both economic and cultural Marxism rely on expropriation. When the classical Marxists, the communists, took over a country like Russia, they expropriated the bourgeoisie. They took away their property. Similarly, when the cultural Marxists take over a university campus or something else, including a society as a whole, they expropriate through things like quotas for admissions. When a white student with superior qualifications is denied admittance to a college in favor of a black or Hispanic who is not as well qualified, the white student is expropriated. And indeed, affirmative action in our whole society today is a system of expropriation. White companies, white-owned companies don't get a contract because the contract is reserved for a company owned by, say, Hispanics or women. So expropriation is a principal tool of both forms of Marxism. And finally, both have a method of analysis that automatically gives the answer they want. For the classical Marxist, it's Marxist economics. For the cultural Marxists, it is deconstruction. Deconstruction essentially takes any text, removes all the meaning from it, and then reinserts whatever meaning they desire. So that we find, for example, that all of Shakespeare is about the suppression of women, or the Bible is really about race and gender. All of these texts simply become grist for the mill that prove, quote unquote, that all of history, again, is about which groups have power over which other groups. So the parallels are very evident between the classical Marxism that we're familiar with in the old Soviet Union and the cultural Marxism that we see today as political correctness. But the parallels are not accidental. The parallels did not come from nothing. The fact of the matter is that political correctness has a history, a much longer history than anyone that very many people are aware of outside a small group of academics who have studied this. And the history goes back, as I said, to World War I, as do so many of the pathologies that are today bringing our society and indeed our culture down. Marxist theory said that when the general European war came, as it did come in Europe in 1914, that the working class throughout Europe would rise up and overthrow their governments, the bourgeois governments, because the workers had more in common with each other across national boundaries than they had in common with the bourgeoisie and the ruling class in their own country. Well, 1914 came, and it didn't happen. Throughout Europe, the workers rallied to their flag and happily marched off to fight each other. The Kaiser shook hands with the leader of the then Marxist Social Democratic Party in Germany and said, "There are no parties now, there are only Germans." And this happened in every country in Europe. So something was wrong. Marxists knew by definition it couldn't be the theory. In 1917, they finally get a Marxist coup in Russia, and it looks like the theory is working. But then it stalls again. It doesn't spread. And when attempts are made to spread it immediately after the war, with the Spartacist uprising in Berlin, with the Belekun government in Hungary, with the Munich Soviet, the workers don't support them. So the Marxists had a problem, and two Marxist theorists went to work on it, Antonio Gramsci in Italy and Georg Lukács in Hungary. Gramsci said that the workers can never see their true class interest as defined by Marxism until they are freed from Western culture and particularly from the Christian religion, that they are blinded by culture and religion to their true class interests. Lukács, who was considered the most brilliant Marxist theorist since Marx himself, said in 1919, "Who will save us from Western civilization?" He also theorized that the great obstacle to the creation of a Marxist paradise was the culture, was Western civilization itself. And he gets a chance to put his ideas into practice, because when the homegrown Bolshevik Belekun government is established in Hungary in 1919, he becomes deputy commissar for culture. And the first thing he did was introduce sex education into the Hungarian schools. That ensured, by the way, that the workers would not support the Belekun government, because the Hungarian people looked at this aghast, workers as well as anyone else. But he already had made the connection that today many of us are still surprised by, that we would consider the latest thing. In 1923, in Germany, a think tank is established that takes on the role of translating Marxism from economic into cultural terms, that creates political correctness as we know it today, and that essentially has created the basis for it by the end of the 1930s. This comes about because the young, very wealthy son of a millionaire German trader, a fellow named Felix Weil, has become a Marxist, and he has lots of money to spend. And he is disturbed by the divisions among the Marxists. So he sponsors something called the First Marxist Work Week, when he brings Lukács and many of the key German thinkers together for a week of working on the differences within Marxism. And then he says what we need is a think tank. Washington's full of think tanks today. We think of those as very modern. In fact, they go back quite a ways. He endows an institute associated with Frankfurt University, established in 1923, that was originally to be known as the Institute for Marxism. But the people behind it decided at the beginning, in a tendency that now is very clear in political correctness as a whole, that it was not to their advantage to be openly identified as Marxists. The last thing political correctness wants is for people to figure out that it's a form of Marxism. So they instead name it the Institut für Sozialforschung, the Institute for Social Research. Weil is very clear about his goals here. In 1971, he wrote to Martin Jay, the author of a principal book on the Frankfurt School, as the Institute for Social Research, it soon becomes known as informally. He said, quote, "I wanted the Institute to become known and perhaps famous due to its contributions to Marxism." Well, he was successful. The first director of the Institute, Karl Grünberg, an Austrian economist, concluded his opening address, according to Martin Jay, by clearly stating his personal allegiance to Marxism as a scientific methodology. Marxism would be the ruling principle at the Institute, and that never changed. The initial work of the Institute was rather conventional, but in 1930 it acquired a new director named Max Horkheimer. And Horkheimer's views were very different. He was very much a Marxist renegade. In addition, overall, the people who create and form the Frankfurt School are renegade Marxists. They're still very much Marxist in their thinking, but they're effectively read out of the party. Moscow looks at what they're doing and says, wait a minute, this isn't us. We're not going to bless this. Horkheimer's initial heresy is he's very interested in Freud. And the key to making the translation of Marxism from economic into cultural terms is essentially that it combined it with Freudianism. Again, Martin Jay writes, if it can be said that in the early years of its history, the Institute concerned itself primarily with an analysis of bourgeois society's socio-economic substructure, and I'd point out that Jay is very sympathetic to the Frankfurt School. I'm not reading from a critic here. In the years after 1930, its prime interest lay in its cultural superstructure. Indeed, the traditional Marxist formula regarding the relation between the two was called into question by critical theory. The stuff we've been hearing about this morning, the radical feminism, the women's studies departments we see in universities, the gay study departments, the black studies departments, all of these things are branches of critical theory. What the Frankfurt School essentially does is, drawing on both Marx and Freud, in the 1930s, it creates a theory that it calls critical theory. The term is ingenious because you're tempted to ask and say, all right, what is the theory? The theory is to criticize. The theory is that the way to bring down Western culture and the capitalist order is not to lay out an alternative. They explicitly refuse to do that. They say it can't be done, that we can't not imagine what a free society would look like, their definition of free, as long as we're living under repression, the repression of a capitalist economic order which creates, in their theory, the Freudian condition, the conditions Freud describes in individuals of repression. That we cannot even imagine this. What the critical theory about is simply criticizing. It calls for the most destructive criticism possible in every possible way, designed to bring the current order down. And of course, when we hear about, again, these comments that feminists saying that, well, the whole of society today is just out to get women and so on, that kind of criticism is all a derivative of critical theory. It is all coming in the 1930s, not the 1960s. Other key members who join up around this time include Theodor Adorno, and most importantly, Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse. Fromm and Marcuse introduce an element which is now central to political correctness, and that's the sexual element. And particularly Marcuse, who in his own writings calls for a society of polymorphous perversity. That's his definition of the future they want to create. Marcuse, in particular, by the 30s, is writing some very extreme stuff on the need for sexual liberation. But this runs through the whole institute. So do most of the themes that we now see in political correctness. Again, as early as the 30s. In Erich Fromm's view, masculinity and femininity were not reflections of essential sexual differences, as the Romantics had thought. They were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined. Sex is a construct. Sexual differences are a construct. The emphasis we now see on environmentalism. Materialism, as far back as Hobbes, had led to a manipulative, dominating attitude towards nature. That was Horkheimer, writing in 1933 in Materialismus und Moral. The theme of man's domination of nature, according to Jay, was to become a central concern of the Frankfurt School in subsequent years. Horkheimer's antagonism, again in the 30s, to the fetishization of labor, here's where they're obviously departing from Marxist orthodoxy, expressed another dimension of his materialism, the demand for human sensual happiness. In one of his most trenchant essays, Egoism and the Movement for Emancipation, written in 1936, he discussed the hostility to personal gratification inherent in bourgeois culture. and he specifically referred to the Marquis de Sade favorably for his protest against asceticism in the name of a higher morality. How does all of this stuff come here? How does it flood into our universities, and indeed into our lives today? The members of the Frankfurt School are Marxist. They are also, to a man, Jewish. In 1933, the Nazis come to power in Germany, and not surprisingly, they immediately shut down the Institute for Social Research. And its members flee. They flee to New York City, and the Institute is reestablished there in 1933 with help from Columbia University. And the members of the school, gradually through the 30s, though most of them continue to write in German, they gradually shift their focus from critical theory about German society, destructive criticism of every aspect of that society, to critical theory directed at American society. There is another very important translation when the war comes. Some of them go to work for the government, including Herbert Marcuse, who becomes a key figure in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and some, including Horkheimer and Adorno, move to Hollywood. These origins of political correctness would probably not mean much to us today, except for two subsequent events. The first was the student rebellion here in the mid-1960s, which was driven largely by resistance to the draft and to the Vietnam War. But the student rebels needed theory of some sort. They couldn't just get out there and say, hell no, we don't want to go. They had to have some theoretical explanation behind it. Very few of them were interested in wading through Das Kapital. Classical economic Marxism is not light, and most of the radicals of the 60s were not deep. Fortunately for them, and unfortunately for our country today, and not just in the universities, Herbert Marcuse remained in America when the Frankfurt School after the war relocates back to Frankfurt. And whereas Mr. Adorno and Horkheimer in Germany are appalled by the student rebellion when it breaks out there, when the student rebels come into Adorno's classroom, he calls the police and has them arrested. Herbert Marcuse, who remained here, saw the 60s student rebellion as the great chance. The opportunity to take the work of the Frankfurt School and make it the theory of a new left in the United States. And one of his books was the key book in this. It became virtually the Bible of the SDS and the student rebels of the 60s, and that book was Eros and Civilization. The essence of it is that Marcuse argues that under a capitalist order, he downplays the Marxism very, very strongly here. The book is subtitled Philosophical Inquiry into Freud. But the framework is Marxist. He essentially argues that in a capitalist order, again, repression is the essence of that order, and that gives us the person Freud describes, the person with all the hang-ups, the neuroses, because his sexual instincts are repressed. That we can envision a future, if we can only destroy this existing oppressive order, in which we liberate eros, in which we liberate the libido, in which we have a world, again, his own phrase, of polymorphous perversity, in which you can do your own thing. And by the way, in that world, there will no longer be any work, there'll only be play. What a wonderful message for the radicals of the mid-60s. They're students. They're baby boomers. They've grown up never having to worry about anything except eventually having to get a job. And here comes along a guy who's writing in ways they can easily follow and doesn't require them to read a lot of heavy Marxism, and tells them everything they want to hear, which is essentially, do your own thing. If it feels good, do it. You never have to go to work. And by the way, Marcuse is the man who creates the phrase, make love, not war. He also explicitly states, coming back to the situation people now face on campus, that he defines liberating tolerance as intolerance from any movement coming from the right and tolerance for any movement coming from the left. Marcuse, as I said, joins the Frankfurt School when? In 1932. if I remember right. So all of this goes back to the 1930s. In conclusion, America today is in the throes of the greatest and direst transformation in its history. We are becoming an ideological state, a state with an official state ideology enforced by the power of the state. In hate crimes, we now have people serving jail sentences for political thoughts. And the Congress is now moving to expand that category ever further. Affirmative action is part of it. The terror against anyone who dissents from political correctness on campus is part of it. It's exactly what we've seen happen in Russia, in Germany, in Italy, in China, and it's now coming here, and we don't recognize it because we just call it political correctness and laugh it off. My message this morning is it's not funny. It's here, it is growing apace, and it is eventually going to destroy, as it seeks to destroy, everything that we have ever defined as our freedom and our culture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to all our panelists. They were excellent. We have 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so if you would raise your hand, I'd love to have you ask our panelists anything you'd like. Since we have a lot of victim groups here today, I'm sure that a lot of you will. Yes, Wes.
Obviously, Bill, this whole thing that you've discussed predates, if it predates the 60s, it certainly predates Bill Clinton's administration. But when you stop to think about it, does this not dovetail, this whole cultural Marxism and political correctness and controlling of thought and controlling of speech, dovetail into such things as the FBI files, the IRS audits, truth is whatever you want it to be, harassing ordinary citizens who heckle the president, and that sort of thing. And isn't this combination such that it might be perfect, right for the timing of forming some kind of grassroots movement against this kind of blatant oppression?
Well, let me say, first of all, the Clinton administration, Clinton is the first baby boomer president. So it's not surprising that this administration would be steeped in PC. But I would note that this has now spread so far through the establishment. Virtually, it's now a rule. If you're going to be a member of the establishment, you must be politically correct. The last Republican convention that nominated Bob Dole was choreographed for political correctness. And those who didn't share that view were explicitly invited to leave, which they did in the voting booth as well. There's no question that the grassroots is sick of this stuff. Americans don't want to have to be afraid of what they think, of what they say, of what they write, of saying the wrong thing and being in trouble with some kind of legal or quasi-legal authority for doing it. I think the potential is there for a grassroots resistance movement. I think the most important thing to do is break the Frankfurt School's own silence. Again, it was very, very careful to disguise its origins, initially in Germany, but then much more so when it came here, and to disguise its Marxism. And if the average American realizes that this stuff is Marxism, that it's a heretical school of it, but it is totally Marxist in its origins, then the light bulb will go on, and he'll realize what he's dealing with.
One of the major developments that resulted from the Frankfurt School was the insidious but very effective political correctness movement. And its effect